everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. This episode of the show is being sponsored by my friends over at a company called Real Mushrooms, realmushrooms.com. Sky Chilton and his father, Jeff Chilton. I interviewed Jeff a number of episodes ago. Really interesting guys. I really enjoyed that conversation with Jeff. And it's a company that sells and distributes medicinal mushrooms in powder or capsule form. I was really happy to have these guys come on. I think they're very much in alignment with the values of the podcast. As you all know, a big part of this podcast is about plant medicine, holistic medicine, and I think the benefits of medicinal mushrooms are truly fantastic, and I think there's really a growing body of work that's really showing and alluding to all of the amazing properties that mushrooms have. They sell a lot of different mushrooms, things you've probably heard of, like reishi, chaga, lion's mane, turkey tail, cordyceps. Those are all mushrooms I work with. They're part of what I consider for myself a really holistic supplement regime. And the thing I really love about their company, not only are they really good guys, I think they're really ethical guys, but the product is really amazing. It's all 100% mushrooms. They're organic, and that's really rare. For better or for worse, the supplement industry is highly unregulated, and so often when you get supplements, you don't necessarily know what you're getting. You may be getting some mushroom, you may be getting a bunch of fillers and other things. Oftentimes, even when you're buying what may be a mushroom, it may not have any of that mushroom in it at all, unfortunately. Even some of the big, I think even the biggest company that sells mushrooms, actually it's not the fruiting body, not the mushroom itself. It's the mycelial, which is grown on grain, and then those things are mixed up and then sold in a supplement form. So not only are you not getting the mushroom itself, you're getting the mycelium mixed with grain. So it's one of the amazing things of Real Mushrooms is it's exactly that. It's real mushrooms. So it's 100% mushrooms, organic. So you're getting a really good product. You're getting the actual fruiting body, the mushroom itself, 100% of that. And again, just really great guys. I'm really happy to have them on and supporting this podcast. So if you'd like a really good product, you'd like to start working with medicinal mushrooms, check out their site, realmushrooms.com. And also listeners of this show, if you go to their site, realmushrooms.com/universe, you get 25% off your first order, which is a really good deal. And I think once you start working and tasting their products, you'll really see and feel a big difference. So thank you to them. And I think that's it. And without further ado, here is the intro to the show. On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with my friend Brian James. I've known Brian for quite a long time now, I think over 10 years. I met him a number of years ago when we were both working at an Amazonian plant medicine healing center called the Temple of the Way of Light. I think he also has the distinction now of being the first person who's been on the podcast 3 times. He was on one of the early episodes of the podcast, and he was also on a panel discussion that I had with myself and another mutual friend and colleague of ours, Adam Aronovich. Brian recently published a new book called Traumadelic, so I brought him on to speak about that. It's a theme that I think is really important, something I've seen and I think spoken about a lot in the time that I've been doing this work as well. And it's this idea of really kind of the cross-section of how this traditional plant medicine work is really being bridged and brought into a more Western psychotherapeutical modality that especially focuses on trauma. And while there are some benefits to that, there's some really big drawbacks to that as well. If that's controversial, then this podcast hopefully will be very informative to you. And if that's something that you've maybe also thought about, then hopefully this will maybe shed some more light on why that may be. But I think it's a super important topic, and And I always really enjoy sitting down and talking to Brian. I think he has a lot of really interesting ideas and really seeing things from a holistic perspective. So I think that's it for the intro. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, Patreon is really big help. It's a website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. As always, to all the people supporting that way, thank you very much for your help. It's really one of the main ways and things that allows me to continue doing this podcast. And if you're able to do that, thank you very much in advance. One of the things I really like about that platform is it's based off this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, it's a really good way to give back. If you're not able to do that, as always, just helping with the algorithms is super beneficial. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, and if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. I think when this is released, we will be in Dieta running our plant medicine dietas in the Sacred Valley of Peru in February. But maybe when this is released, there'll still be a week or two left. So if you're interested in that, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org. And we may be already sold out by the time this is released, but for sure we should have still availability for our upcoming European retreats, end of April in Portugal and the beginning of July in Ireland. So that's a really beautiful opportunity if this working with plants interests you, to experience the learning, that this also, as we talked about, this very direct experiential contact, often contacting with something like awe or humility, gratitude, a direct learning experience, healing experience. If that interests you, that's a really beautiful way of going about that. So again, I'll put a link to my website in the show notes, nicotianarustica.org. And I think that's it. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Brian.
Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. From the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
So yeah, Brian, it's good to see you. We were chatting a bit before we started. Actually, some interesting topics. Maybe we'll get into some of those too. But I was thinking about it, and I think you're the first three-peat guest on the podcast. So
wow,
I wish
nice.
I had
An
some
honor.
reward to send you, but I don't.
Well, coming back on to talk about some of these ideas and my work, that's reward enough, Jason. So thank you.
Yeah. So you were originally on one of the early episodes. I'm not sure what it was, but I invited you on a bit about our background as we met working probably many years ago. I don't know, 10 years ago now, maybe, at a big ayahuasca healing center in the Peruvian Amazon called the Temple of the Way of Light. I was working there, facilitating there. You were also working there. And I brought you on just because I think we always really connected well. We had a lot of similar views on things. I think we had some differing views too, but I think in general we kind of shared a similar cosmovision, maybe a similar life's path. And the first time you came on, you had also recently released a book, which I think was called Yoga and Plant Medicine, maybe? Was that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we spoke about that, which I think is a really interesting kind of symbiosis of two realms that we often look at as somewhat separate. We kind of look at yoga as this kind of Eastern, maybe mystical practice, and plant medicine is often seen as this kind of maybe New World American, especially very much Amazonian way of connecting to spirit. But I think what you did really well is kind of bridge those two systems and show that there's a lot of overlap and kind of a thesis that I also agree with, which I think really the basis of religions around the world and spiritual practices is some sort of entheogenic experience, some experience of having a direct relationship with spirit, with God, that isn't necessarily just a doctrine, something that we have to believe in. It's a very direct experiential process. Then you also came on when we had a bit of a dialogue, I think of what we'll get into today. We had kind of like a three-way panel with yourself, myself, and another mutual friend, colleague of ours named Adam Aronovich. And I think that was a really fascinating dialogue too. It got really good response, and it was really, again, beginning, I think, to talk about some of these topics, which you recently released a book called Traumadelic, which I think we even used that word in the kind of panel discussion. And I think it's a really fascinating topic, and it's something that I've also been speaking about for a while. I think it really arose probably from your own direct experience, certainly from my direct experience of working in these kind of more traditional, although that's always a bit of a tricky word, but a more traditional setting of working with plants, of working with plant medicines, but very much seeing the influence of this more Western psychiatric model that was kind of being superimposed on these very ancient or traditional processes. And certainly there can be a benefit to that, but I think there's a lot of very, very important drawbacks that I imagine we'll get into, that I think both you and I saw. And so I think it's really amazing that you put those ideas down in a book, because I think it's something that's super important, because this work is really moving out more and more to the mainstream. Obviously, as it moves out into Western culture, it's going to be somehow adopted or co-opted into certain Western values or cosmovisions, which is inevitable, and that's also not necessarily a bad thing. But at the same time, I think it's super, super important to understand the origins of things, and the origins of the cosmovisions of things, how things traditionally have been worked with. Because I think if you cut certain things out and you lose the holistic view of things, you not only do you lose a lot, you may actually lose the very essence of what the thing is. So that's kind of a long intro. I think that's probably the longest intro I've done. But maybe to start, I mean, if people are interested in learning more about you, they can also go back and listen to those 2 episodes. But just as a standalone version, maybe you can just give kind of a brief intro to yourself, about your story. I mean, even as we spoke before we started recording, you were saying that really what got you into this work was your own healing journey. So maybe just very briefly what that journey is like, or what it has been like, and what got you interested in things like yoga and plant medicine, and then what began to kind of inspire you to begin writing your first book and this new book that we'll begin to speak about.
Yeah, well, your intro, I mean, kind of sets up the book really well. All of those questions that you're asking are questions that started to formulate in my mind as I got involved in, let's say, like the healing world. And yeah, like you said, I got into it seeking my own healing. Although at the time, I wouldn't have used that word. I was just dealing with a lot of suffering, a lot of symptoms. Like I started what got me interested in yoga and plant medicine. I mean, I started exploring this stuff in the 90s when I was a very young man. And what got me interested in that was just like exploring life, exploring the kind of the edges of life, like the weird and the esoteric. That's what originally got me interested in this stuff. I had no concept of healing, or even that there was anything really wrong with me. I didn't have that perspective yet. So it was just like an interest in life and wanting to explore consciousness and what was outside of kind of conventional everyday consciousness. I had always had a very vivid dream life when I was a kid that bled over into my waking life quite often. I was very interested in fantasy books, especially, looking back, I can see like a lot of the books I was interested in were where the protagonist would enter into some other world that was like right next door to our world. They'd enter through some kind of portal into this fantastical world where magic was alive. So I think like that kind of, I don't know, the shamanic seed was always alive in me. And so when I started to explore psychedelics and yoga in my teens, it was very much a part of that. Just wanting to know like what else is out there. From a very young age, as long as I can remember, not really being satisfied with the status quo of what life was about and what was expected of us. There's always a drive to explore the outer reaches, to say. But I had a career as a graphic designer. I eventually got into that in my 20s and had a very successful career working in design agencies and then in advertising agencies. And by the time I got to my mid-30s, I'd been married for a few years, and we'd bought a house, and everything was like on track, in terms of like conventional life and those expectations. I was really successful, and I was doing a creative job, and so that felt satisfying to me. But at the same time, I was dealing with a lot of stress and anxiety that I didn't know what to do with. I tried everything. I mean, I would go to yoga classes and they would help while I was doing it. But whenever we got asked to lie down in Shavasana, I would often have panic attacks. All of this kind of suppressed anxiety and fear would arise in me as I started to relax. And I was having like night sweats, just a lot of symptoms. And so I finally reached out for help. I found a therapist who worked in a kind of Jungian approach. And so he was working with dreams and things. So I thought he would be a good fit. There was something in his website where he described himself as a practitioner or had interest in hermetic shamanism. And that caught my interest. I was like, here's a guy who's working on the edges. And so it ended up we were a really great fit. And so we started working with dreams, actually. And that was helping me to understand myself and what was going on in me. It was really, really helpful. And there got to a point where he thought that it would be helpful if I re-explored psychedelics with some more intention. If I wanted to continue to kind of dig in and see what was under the surface that was causing me all of these symptoms of stress and anxiety, he thought psychedelics would be a helpful way to do that. So he suggested that I try some mushrooms, but set it up, pay attention to the set and setting, which I'd never done in my earlier explorations. It was just like going for it, seeing what would happen. So I did this. I set up a night for myself and got some mushrooms and, had a journal and a music playlist with some of my favorite music, and had this incredible experience where I felt like I reconnected to my innate creativity that I'd been kind of selling in my pursuit of a successful career as a graphic designer. I ended up working for companies that I had no interest in. The products I was helping to develop and sell were stuff that, not only not interested in, but I actually was like adverse to promoting them at some point. So there's like a real conflict between the creative drive in me and how it was getting expressed in this commercial world of graphic design and advertising. So in this experience, I connected to that like creative source in me and my love of creativity and music. And it was a really beautiful, joyful experience. It felt like a real coming home. And so, I went back to the therapist and I gave him my report, and he thought it was wonderful. And, he worked with me on drawing mandalas and doing all these kind of Jungian practices to bring some of that stuff into the material world in a creative way. And it was really amazing. And then at a certain point, we got to, I guess, like a point in our therapeutic relationship where he thought maybe we had done enough work together. Like I had the tools, I had this like reconnection to my creative spirit, and all that was going pretty well. He thought, well, if you're interested in going even deeper, I'm a part of this church. It's from Brazil. It's called the Santo Daime. And of course, at that time, I'd never heard of it. I knew what ayahuasca was from reading people like Terence McKenna and William Burroughs, back in the 90s. I had never been attracted to ayahuasca. It just seemed so far away and so foreign that I thought I would never encounter it because growing up in the 70s and 80s, I was terrified of the Amazon because there was a lot of stuff in TV shows and movies that showed people getting strangled by anacondas and getting swallowed up by quicksand. So I had this like real fear of the Amazon. And so I'd never imagined myself going to this place. And of course, never imagined that ayahuasca was being brought up into the north. So he told me this church is happening. It's in Canada. And he sent me a little video that was all in Portuguese. There wasn't really any media online about the Santo Daime at that point, other than some stuff that came out of Brazil. So I knew very little going in. I had some images from this video of people all in white dancing around a circle. I don't know. They look like a nice bunch of people having a good time. So I thought, well, this, this could be interesting at the very least. So anyway, he was responsible enough to say that if I wanted to explore this and go to his church, that we would end our therapeutic relationship, which looking back and having some therapeutic training myself, I really admire that he was clear about having any kind of dual relationship there. He said, the nature of our relationship is going to change if you come to the church. So if you're comfortable, we'll end our therapeutic relationship and I'll bring you along so you can experience this thing and check it out. And so I did. But I had very little expectation or preparation for what I encountered in that space. And the Daime quite literally knocked me on my ass. And when I awoke, I got literally knocked out of my chair at one point and passed out for a while. And when I came to, I had this whole experience of being welcomed back into the circle. And there was, again, that feeling of homecoming, like coming home to myself and also coming home into a community of people who welcomed me in. And that was a really kind of deep wound for me, was feeling like an outsider, not feeling included, not really being able to relate to a lot of the people around me. And so that in itself, that being welcomed back into the circle by these smiling faces who cared about me, were worried about me when I was down and out in the corner and were taking care of me and that kind of thing, that in itself was like a really healing experience. And I walked away from that ceremony with like a renewed perspective on life. That sense of like the wonder and beauty of the world was reawakened in me. So I felt like I recovered something very essential in that experience. And of course, it was so powerful that I just wanted to continue to explore it. I wanted to know, like, what else is possible? Like, if that's possible, what else is possible? And I'll say too that, when I was working in the advertising world, a big part of that world was going out and drinking. That was how we kind of blew off steam and how we socialized and formed those bonds that were so important, when working in those kind of companies. And it was a way that I was trying to cope with some of these symptoms. So I was drinking a lot and kind of indiscriminately taking drugs I was really always interested in getting into altered states, and I was doing that in ways that were really unhealthy. Um, but after that initial experience in the Central Daime with ayahuasca, the urge to drink and get drunk left me completely. I just didn't want it anymore. And that to me was like a kind of a miracle and totally unexpected. I didn't go into it thinking, I really should start cleaning myself up and like drinking less and that kind of thing. And I think maybe I'm a bit of an alcoholic and I should get some treatment for that. That hadn't crossed my mind. In fact, I'd had a few drinks with friends the night before the ceremony because I didn't really know a whole lot about how to prepare for these things. But like after that ceremony, the urge to drink like that just left. And that was incredible. And so that was like the beginning of this like exploring the world of healing. And I got deeper into yoga. I did a yoga teacher training in like 2011. I quit the advertising world. My wife and I moved out to the West Coast so we could lead a more kind of simple and natural life. So a lot of big changes in my mid 30s, and really just getting into the healing world. I had experienced such a transformation in myself that I just felt like I wanted to help others who maybe like me had no idea how to go about helping themselves get out of whatever pit they were stuck in, whatever kind of, you know, confluence of destructive patterns. And I wanted to be like that guy who was there when I, searched for a shamanic therapist in Toronto. He was there. And I wanted to be there for other people who were looking for someone who had also like pulled themselves out of something and found things that helped. So I started, I was teaching yoga. I was doing a therapeutic orientation to yoga. So teaching people one-on-one, really helping them to address specific problems that they were dealing with. And as a part of that, people started bringing more of their like life's problems to me, and we'd have these like talk therapy sessions. And I realized I really enjoyed supporting people in that way. So I started to do a lot of training about how to be a counselor or a therapist. And in that, I started to see that trauma, being trauma informed, was a huge part of that world. And I'd seen it a few years earlier in the yoga world, all of a sudden, it was like trauma was in the zeitgeist, and everybody who was a yoga teacher had to be trauma informed and had to be doing a trauma informed practice. And there was a lot of expectations around that were actually not congruent with the way I was taught how to teach yoga. So things like touching someone to help them discover something in a posture or help to correct some kind of misalignment. That all of a sudden was verboten for people who were coming in with this trauma-informed perspective. So there's a lot of things like that I started to see were also in this therapy world. It's like, again, trauma was everywhere. Everything was about childhood trauma. Everybody who was a practitioner had to be up to speed on trauma theory and being a trauma-informed. And I guess I started to see that as very limiting. People coming to me for help with this focus. I want to dig into my childhood trauma. I'm sure that it's at the root of my problems. I've watched this video with Gabor Mate or Peter Levine or Bessel van der Kolk. A lot of this stuff was getting really, really popular, and people were finding out about it. And I think really attracted to that narrative that there's something there that explains why I am the way I am. And they're also offering a way out. So I don't blame people at all who are really taken in by this theory and this narrative around trauma, because a lot of us are looking for answers as to why do I feel so fucked up? Why does my nervous system feel so out of control? But I think the childhood experience is only one part of that. And we need to be looking at the larger picture of how the society and the culture around us affects us. and how the status quo lifestyle affects us. So anyway, that's like what got me thinking about this and looking critically at what was going on, which led to writing some essays and then eventually compiling them into this book. So that's a big history. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. So there's a lot there.
Hmm.
So I guess one place to start. So you started at Santo Daime, and if people are kind of unfamiliar, that's it's a church that was founded in Brazil. It has origins in kind of the native or indigenous ayahuasca shamanic practice, but it also has influences from, um, it's very representative of
It's
Brazil as a country.
eclectic, it's syncretic, just like Brazil. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's
Spirituality in
African,
Brazil is always a kind of,
Christian.
yeah, it's always mixed up. So Santo Daime was founded by a black rubber tapper in Brazil who had encountered indigenous people in his work in the jungle in I think in the northwest of Brazil in the Acre region. And someone had given him ayahuasca, and he had a vision of this woman in the moon, and she told him that he was going to start this religion, and he started to develop it. And so it was influenced by all the stuff that was going on in the first part of the 20th century in Brazil. So there's some like European spiritism going on there. There was some of the Afro-Brazilian religions like Umbanda and Candomblé, and then his own kind of Christianism. So it was all kind of mixed up in this. And so very syncretic, very eclectic, not orthodox in any respect. And so the part of that is something I love too. And music is a big part of the ceremony, and everybody sings, not just the person leading the ceremony. And there's always well, I think in a lot of churches, there's always a mother and father, a madrina and a padrino, who are kind of like running the different chapters of the church. And so there's a lot of emphasis placed on the balance of the masculine and feminine aspects. But there's some kind of like strange militaristic aspects to it too. They're very rigid about the way the ceremony is run, and people wear uniforms, and the initiated members wear these little medals and different costumes. So it's very kind of strange and I mean, very interesting. As someone who's interested in world religions and as a kind of like amateur anthropologist, part of my attraction to it, to continuing with that for the next number of years, was just like exploring this strange expression of the religious impulse that was so different from my own kind of like Anglican Protestant upbringing, and even, going to a Roman Catholic high school where there was like a little more kind of ritual and things like that. But this was something altogether different. This was about each person involved in the ritual having an experience of gnosis, of direct connection with, lots of different entities, not just like source or something big and abstract like that, but it's very polytheistic. So you could do ceremonies that were meant to invoke Saint Michael, for instance, the archangel, or like Iemanjá, the goddess of the ocean from the from the Yoruba tradition. So that was like very fascinating for me. It was like kind of like insider anthropology or theology in a way, studying these different religions from the inside and having direct experiences. That was a big draw for me as well.
So I think one of the interesting things, I mean, because I think Santo Daime is a really interesting amalgamation in that way. Like most of us would consider Brazil part of the Western world, very, very Catholic country as well. And yet it is tapping into maybe what we would describe as these more shamanic practices. And, but even as you were mentioning this idea of Roman Catholicism, I think even in kind of the Western world, that's something we seem to be disconnected from. I mean, I was recently in Russia, and I was very amazed because going to a lot of the churches, you look at the motifs in the ceiling, and there was
Mhm.
these epic battles between light and dark, between good and evil, between the seraphims and the cherubins, and the angels and the saints, and battling demons, and this. And I think in the West, maybe in this more kind of Protestant way of looking at it, a lot of that has been maybe glossed over, or
Well,
seen as not important.
it's been stripped away. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
stripped
mean, that
away.
was the Protestant Revolution, was stripping away all of that stuff that they'd seen as been like accumulated around the essential core teachings of Christianity and kind of clouded the essence of it. So Protestantism was an effort to return to the essence and strip away all of the icons, all of the ritual. So if you go into a Protestant church, it's like going into a modernist building, and there's maybe one kind of minimalist cross in the whole place, but they've done away with a lot of that richness that you'll see in the Orthodox churches.
Yeah, so I guess that kind of leads to maybe the first kind of big question, and it is a big question, but you you touched on this in your first book, Yoga and Shamanism, and then also in this book, Traumadelic, you're very much speaking about this idea of shamanism as kind of the root of a lot of these practices. What does that word mean to you? Because I think it's a word that's thrown around a lot. People have a lot of different ideas of what that means. Um, so yeah, I guess the question is just what does that mean to you? Like when you use the word shaman or shamanism, what are you referring to?
Yeah, well, the scholar of religions, Mircea Eliade, he defined it as archaic techniques of ecstasy. So ecstasy is standing outside of oneself. Um, and I think that's not like a bad starting point to understanding the word shamanism. Of course, it's an umbrella term that was created by anthropologists, and so it's trying to cover a lot of ground in a way. So we have to understand that within the umbrella of shamanism, there's a whole diverse range of different cosmologies and practices and traditions. So just to be clear about that, but it's a kind of a shorthand, I guess, to something like the Gnostic experience. Uh, Shamanism to me is about that impulse to know for oneself, to know directly, uh, what's going on behind the scenes. And so using any number of techniques to stand outside of yourself, outside of the kind of the conditioned mind, let's say, and to have other aspects of reality revealed to oneself. So shamanism to me, like essentially is about that direct experience with no intermediary. Of course, within shamanic traditions, often it's the shamanic practitioner who is standing outside of oneself to receive information, divination, guidance, that kind of thing, in uh, in order to help a patient, right? But I think like one of the things that happened in the West is with the introduction of psychedelics into the West and a lot of anthropological information about shamanic traditions, like Westerners tend to do, we said, well, we got to try this for ourselves. And so there's a lot of like freedom in that, the ability to be a kind of shamanic practitioner yourself and to have access to these archaic techniques of ecstasy that maybe our own ancestors didn't have because Christianity has a long history of cutting people off from that kind of experience. It's seen as heretical. So I think like, when Terence McKenna called it an archaic revival, that's what he was talking about is, Western people who had been living within the grips of Christianity and all of its dogmas were now feeling free to explore the Gnostic path themselves for the first time in, centuries. So I think that also was also part of the excitement in the 60s with the introduction of not only psychedelics, but practices around yoga and different kinds of shamanic techniques like drumming, that kind of thing. So it's all part of that for me. So shamanism, yeah, big umbrella term, but basically it's a way to know for yourself, or to have direct contact with mm, different entities, different spirits, things outside of the mundane realm.
It's interesting because often words that you hear kind of associated with, again, what could generically be referred to as a shaman, because often those words, I think, are maybe less and less used. But like, for example, the word that I often hear used is healer. Like that seems to be kind of the
Hmm.
most common word. Or, sometimes you'll hear like in Spanish, médico, like a doctor. But I think many Western people refer to these people as healers. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Because I think, on the one hand, because we have perhaps lost contact with these practices, we try and superpose it or superimpose it into some model that we have. And maybe the closest model we have is a doctor, someone who kind of heals you. But even in that framework, I think it's interesting because what we view as healing is usually something very much in the physical realm. And
Hmm.
but even if you were to look at the root of that word healing, it means to make whole.
Hmm.
And but I think that's not really what people are referring to. They're
No.
referring to something in terms of healing, more like a doctor healing, and that you're going there because you're sick, usually maybe a physical condition, or maybe some people would say some sort of psychological condition.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because even that word, as you said, shaman, it's usually often linguistically derived back to the word sama, that Siberian word, which means to see, or often, as you said, to know. Like, for example, the Shipibo who we worked with, most people know the Shipibo as a group of people highly skilled in ayahuasca, but for them, their word for ayahuasca is uni, and someone who works with uni is an unaya. And how you would usually translate that word is one who knows, one who has wisdom. And I think often an older
Mm-hmm.
way, even in Spanish, that people would refer to these people like a shaman would be a sabio or una sabia. Like, and again, it's someone who knows that there's a
Mm-hmm.
certain wisdom that they guard, and that it's not necessarily even just healing and like, I'm sick, I have gastritis or diabetes, I want you to
Yeah.
heal me. There's something that's seen as a deeper knowledge that could potentially heal this, but that's not even necessarily the focus of what they're trying to do. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's part of, and again, this is a very big subject, but kind of the maybe more Western idea that we have of looking at things in a very reductionist way, that it's simply, this is the thing that I need to cure, while not necessarily looking at all of the other pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah. That's a great point. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. Shamanism is ways toward acquiring knowledge, and that knowledge could be about anything. It could be about where to find prey. Like, geez, I haven't seen any capybaras around lately, and everyone's starting to get hungry in the village. Let's take some of this medicine and see if we can see where all of the food has gone so we can feed everybody. It could be that kind of knowledge. Or things haven't been going well around here. Let's take some of this medicine so we might see if someone's put like a curse on us. If like that brujo in the next village has somehow cursed us. So healing could be one part of that, like knowledge about the nature of the disease and what plants or treatments might be helpful. But yeah, the healing part of it is only one part of shamanism. And of course, like coming in as Well, first of all, we were talking about, you're talking about the distinction between like, the West and the East. And maybe it's even more helpful to get more nuance with it, that even in the West, there's a North and a South. And there's a big kind of like distinction, I think, in the mindset of people from the North in contrast to people of the South. And so even like kind of getting a little more differentiated in that, like, yes, yeah, South America is in the West kind of technically, and it's been colonized to a large extent by Western people. But it's also still part of this global South, which, I don't know, there just seems to be a kind of a different mentality there. Yeah, so as Westerners, as Northwesterners, we come into these traditions completely conditioned by our culture. And we're coming out of a therapized or a therapy-oriented culture. And the older I get, the more political I'm becoming. And I'm starting to see the larger picture of why we are the way we are. And that's always been something like I've tried to understand. It's what got me really interested in psychology. But starting to look at that politically, like, why have we been conditioned in this particular way? And a lot of it has to do with putting the onus on the individual person to take care of themselves in order that they're well adapted and functional members of this society. So therapy has really promoted that, upheld that belief that it's like, it's on me to do my work so that I feel okay enough to function in the society, rather than pulling back and looking at the society that is making people sick in the first place and doing the therapy on the culture. And so psychotherapy over the past 150 years or so has really kept the focus on healing the individual to become more well-adapted, functioning members of the society. And I think there's been a kind of underground movement over the past 50, 60 years that's saying we have to look at the society, actually. And it's not up to each individual to make sure that they can cope with what's going on. But we got to get the real root cause of it is society as a whole. And so, we come in with these expectations that it's up to us to do our individual healing. And that's why we go to these medicine people to help us with our individual healing. Whereas those people in their context, if the whole village was coming to them and saying, look, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I can't stop drinking, I'm an addict, whatever's going on, they would say, maybe there's something going on in the community or in the environment that we have to look at. And so their diagnosis would probably extend way beyond just that individual person. The individual person coming with these symptoms is just a symptom of a larger sickness. And that hasn't happened in the mainstream West yet. Although I feel like the tide is shifting and people are starting to question the beliefs around therapy and kind of trauma therapy specifically. That the way I'm feeling is because of what happened in my past. That's way too reductive, too simplistic, and it doesn't actually help people out of the predicament that they're in, which is that we're living in a very sick society here in North America and beyond. But I happen to live in North America, so I know it best, and what people are dealing with here. So
yeah, there's a lot there I'd like to touch on. Kind of going back to the idea of shaman to kind of begin to wrap that up, just so we have like some groundwork to stand on. I found it interesting because you said one of the things in your own personal experience is you you didn't use this word, but kind of that you went through this dark night of the soul. You experienced these kind of debilitating emotions, anxiety and fear and stress, and then you found a path, like which is kind of the archetypal hero's journey. You found a path. You went down this path. You went into the darkness. You found the boon, and then you felt like a calling to then share that. And I think that's also very much an archetypal shaman's journey. Is it's someone who's gone into the darkness and found the light, and then they begin to guide others. Um, I often use a lot of martial arts analogies just because I practice Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but I think it's often a similar thing. Like it's something you're called to do, but you know, in a way, like you're never called to be a shaman. You're called to do your own work. And much like with jujitsu, like you're just called. I think very few people start out with, I want to be a jujitsu teacher, because you don't know any jujitsu. So you just start out to really learn, to have that direct experience. And then usually at a certain point, after many, many years, someone comes to you and they're like, hey, like I see you doing
Mm,
that really well. Could you share
mm,
that? And there's just this innate thing that arises where you're like, well, I can try. And that's kind of the beginning. I was having an interesting
mhm,
conversation with someone recently, and they were saying that like the nature of a shaman or the nature of a guide should be someone who's very neutral. And it it came to me that that also seems to be more maybe of this Western ideology, that you're just there to sit and to listen and to
mhm,
kind of nod your head. Or even maybe this kind of archetypal Eastern mentality of the guru who just kind of sits there and takes everything in and doesn't really do anything.
mm.
But
That's a fantasy because most of the best gurus are full of personality and full of contradiction and anything but neutral. You know, like UG Krishnamurti. I mean, you can't see him; he's on my shirt, but Suki's laying in front of me. But UG Krishnamurti was famous for blasting people, trying to shake them out of their conditioning, and they're seeking for answers and things like that. So, yeah, what you're
and
describing
that's
though,
very much like the nature of the shaman who was the
yeah.
one, even that way, like it's one who sees. And part of what I think that guiding aspect of the shaman was to shake you out of your worldview. And that was often a very traumatic experience. You know, speaking of trauma, it was
Well,
often these are
traumatic
his
to the ego
jobs.
that wants to hold on to that belief system because it feels supported by it, right?
And even as you were saying, like that idea of, you know, the shaman was very often the guide of the village, and it was one who had to make very difficult decisions, like, do we need to go here, or where is the next hunt? And literally the lives of the village were relying on the
Hmm.
vision, the knowing of the shaman. And if he or her didn't fulfill that, it literally could be life and death for the village. And so, you know, there was this also, you know, it reminded me, because I think very much in a lot of these medicine circles, there's a very similar idea that you just rely on the knowledge of these medicines, that essentially you just want to sit there and lay there and do nothing and receive. And you know, you also asked me at the beginning of the podcast kind of some of my understanding of these indigenous practices. And again, it's difficult to speak of indigenous practices because it's
Hmm.
like saying what is an Asian worldview? I mean, there's so many different ones, but one thing that you know, from spending a lot of time with different indigenous groups and being in ceremony, is there is that idea of doing nothing, but that's really 50% of it. That's kind of the archetypal feminine aspect, the receptivity, the allowing, the dissolving, the letting go. But I think what often doesn't get spoken about is the other 50%, which is the more archetypal masculine quality,
Hmm.
which is sitting up, working with your tools, smoking your pipe, calling on your allies. And very much the work of the shaman is very much that as well. You know, the shaman doesn't see something that's bad or something that's out of place in the person's system and says, oh, well, I'm just going to leave it. No, he or she says, no, that's not good. I'm going to move that out. the songs are calling in what they want to bring in. They're calling out what they want to remove. There's a very active process, and
Mhm.
it's not a process of just kind of saying, well, let's just allow what is to be.
Mhm.
It's a very active process. It's a very uh, guided process, and it's a process of also knowing and delineating what's good, what's bad, what should be there, what shouldn't be there.
Yeah, I think the word that feels best for me is it's an interactive process. It's not just active, it's not coming from my individual will, but it's engaging with, like in this case, the plant spirit. And it's there's a communication happening there and there's an interaction happening there. Yeah. So it's not completely passive, just allowing the plants to do all the work. The way I was told to me was like, as someone participating in a ceremony, your job is to sit up straight and concentrate. Uh, and that can be a lot of work, especially with something like ayahuasca, which can have a real kind of lethargic drunkenness effect. Like, I mean, to not give into that impulse to just lie down on the ground or to crawl up in a fetal position demands a lot of strength and focus and work. And like you're saying, when the shaman is called to heal someone, they're doing a lot of work. It's a very physically taxing process for a lot of them. In some cases, they're taking on some part of the sickness of the person, and so they've got to know how to deal with that. And so they can be vomiting, they can be doing their own process of taking that and bringing it somewhere else in the astral realm or however they work. But it's very interactive, very engaged, not passive at all, and certainly not neutral. There's a whole cosmology that you enter into, and that as a participant, you have to submit yourself to that, I think, in order for it to be effective. So you have to go in with a kind of leap of faith in some cases when it's something that's very foreign to you, and have faith that the shaman, the healer, the practitioner knows what they're doing and knows those realms well enough to take care of you as you become, as you're kind of like babe lost in the wilderness. So yeah, like what you're describing when that person's saying like the best kind of facilitation is one that's neutral. That to me sounds like psychedelic psychotherapy in the way they set up those clinical spaces to be completely benign, neutral spaces that, because one of the worst things that you could do is to influence the person's experience somehow. So, like a Protestant church, you're supposed to strip the clinical space of any kind of adornment, maybe a little vase of simple flowers would be allowed, but no kind of religious artifacts, nothing like that would be allowed because that would be seen as influencing the person. And I think in that we're missing something. Like you're saying about these Orthodox churches, they're so rich with imagery and smells and textures. Like when you go into, I think, a good ceremony, it's a very sensual, rich experience. And I've been thinking like more recently that maybe one of the really essential healing factors in this kind of old school way of doing healing work that is not neutral is reawakening people to their sense of beauty. Like we think about all of the aspects in a good ceremony. There's the smells, the incense, the perfumes that are used, all of the things visually that are going on. Like the Shipibo shaman, it's like they put on their work clothes and they're these beautifully embroidered ponchos and hats, and the shamans with the feathers, and maybe they wear like face paint and the bracelets and very ornate necklaces. Beauty is a really important factor in these systems of healing. And I wonder, like, for Westerners who grow up in this kind of Protestant Christian culture, where function is more important than form. You know, in Canada, we have a lot of brutalist architecture, and I do have an appreciation for, I see the beauty in brutalism, but you think about like the big box stores and the way all of the street lamps look very generic now, whereas in the old days you'd have these beautiful ornate lamps on the corner and things. So less and less attention paid to the aesthetics of the environment, especially in cities, you know, where that's really all you get. There's not a lot of nature to compensate for that. So I wonder if like one of like the biggest healing factors in people engaging with these traditions is that reawakening to aesthetic beauty in all its many forms. The songs, the tapestries, the clothing, the the perfumes, all of it.
I think so. I mean, I just from my own story. I mean, I remember being in a lot of places in the West and kind of these suburban landscapes where, as you said, everything is monotonous. It's the same, and always just feeling very low energy. And I didn't really have an explanation why. I mean, I felt it was from the environment, but I didn't understand because other people didn't seem to be having that reaction. And I think it's something about this idea of sensitivity, which is often part of the shaman's
Mhm.
calling, as someone who can correlate things. Um, and that also, just from my own experience, like being in places where there is beauty, being in nature, being even in maybe cities that retain that sense of
Mhm.
beauty, there's a different feeling, there's a different life energy that
Yeah.
fulfills oneself. It also reminded me, two of my recent interviews. One was with an Irish herbalist. Her name is Carol Guyette, and she studied with the Diné, the Navajo people, and one of their traditions is called the Way of Beauty. And it's
Mhm.
seen that like part of the shamanic calling is to bring order, and that bringing order is bringing beauty into one's life. Because
Mhm.
if your life isn't filled with beauty, then it's de facto not filled with beauty. And
Well, and
if you're given the choice,
it's gonna be harmful to your soul.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
Hey,
then also,
Jay,
I was
I'm sorry.
interviewing it.
Sorry, man.
Yes, go ahead.
I gotta stretch my legs. This I need
Yeah,
relief
yeah,
from this little dog. I'm getting a cramp. Just give me a little 1 minute break here, okay?
yeah, sure.
Sorry to be so abrupt there, but it was really uncomfortable.
So yeah, and then it also reminded me. I was interviewing another guy, a really fascinating guy. Spent a lot of time in different indigenous communities, and he was saying one thing that really touched him is his time with the Huni Queen in Brazil.
Mm.
And in the beginning, he found it kind of strange because they kept focusing on this idea in Portuguese. They would say "só alegria," like only
Mm.
joy. Like that's your guiding light is focus on the joy, focus on the joy. And he often found that very strange because he thought it was like some form of like spiritual bypassing. Well, I should be going into the darkness or doing these things. And
Yeah.
also it brought up another thing where I work with this North Native American prayer, and one of the lines in it, it's speaking about the past, and it says, "Build upon the past, its lessons and its joys." But it doesn't say build upon the past, its darkness or its traumas. It says joy specifically, that we really need to focus on that, remember that. But the opposite isn't something negative. It's actually spinning it in a positive sense. Build upon the lessons of the past, which
Mhm.
implies that yes, we're going to go through difficult things, but those can be seen as lessons rather than some sort of thing that we have to hold on to in a negative sense. And I think this kind of leads into to maybe part of the next, very, very big question. Um, but because so much of what we're talking about in this Western model does seem to be focusing on, again, this idea of trauma or childhood trauma or the individual things that have caused us pain or suffering that then we look into, and somehow, I think, as you say, the promise of that is if we really understand that, then we'll somehow be able to transcend that. So, where do you think the origin of that kind of cosmovision is? Like, what is the origin of what we now call Western psychology or psychiatry? That does seem to be very much based in this idea. Because also very
Yeah.
interesting, you use the idea of the mind, and it does seem like a lot of these, like even that word psyche, we often translate to mind, and
Mm.
we are a very mind-based society. And so I
Hmm.
think it's fitting in the sense that we think with our mind that if we can rationally begin to understand the source of this trauma, then we'll be healed.
Hmm.
But even the origin of that word psyche, like it's very much mistranslated. It, even from the Greeks or probably from societies much before that, it meant the totality. It meant this idea of the mind, body, soul, or spirit connection. It was a totality. It wasn't something that was just focusing on the rational mind. So this is a big question, but because we are beginning to talk about the Western cosmovision, Western psychology, where do you think that's originated from, or maybe evolved to where that's such like a pillar of the foundation of that system?
Yeah, it's a really big question. Um, I think it goes back to the beginnings of Christianity. I'm reading another history of Christianity and how it shaped the Western mind, and it's a topic that I find endlessly fascinating. I think if we read into the history of religion, particularly Christianity, we get a much better perspective on how we ended up where we are. And some of that has brought some good things. The equality amongst people, that everybody is deserving of the same love, kindness, and charity. Those kind of essential teachings of Jesus are some of what Christianity has brought in helping civilizations become more humane. Unfortunately, Christianity in the West was shaped largely by men seeking power. And so the doctrines were created by these men in order to, I think, really. Okay, one of the things I was thinking about recently is part of our problem here as kind of displaced Europeans in North America. I think part of the reason why we feel so rootless, or maybe part of the reason why we feel so kind of anxious, out of place, out of sorts, is that we are quite rootless here. We don't have a connection to our ancestors, to our ancestral traditions. And that was one of the ways that Christianity functioned from the very beginning, was to uproot people from the land that they're from and turn them into these kind of wandering pilgrims. And I think that has a lot to do with, people feeling displaced, but also at the root of colonialism. That kind of that feeling of entitlement or superiority, that we know best how people should be and how they should live, and we're going to go around the world and convert everyone to this way of thinking, seeing the world, being in the world. So for me, it goes back to the roots of Western culture, in terms of the Christian movement. And that's very deep. And that's hard for a lot of people to see, because they haven't read about the history of the West or of the growth of Christianity. But what we end up with is a highly individualistic culture. People who are uprooted from land, from tradition, from their ancestors. Like Christianity, one of the big goals is that if you follow the doctrines, you secure your place in heaven. And indigenous religions would be about securing your place in your ancestral line, securing your place on the earth, as well as maybe preparing yourself for the afterlife. So to live in a good way. But that good way didn't exclude how we're living in the here and now in relationship to community, ancestors, land. So why? What are the roots of like trauma culture and this hyper focus on the individual and your expectation that you should be doing your individual healing work? It goes really, really deep. And I think part of the reason why it's so attractive to people and why it's taken such a hold over this culture is because in a kind of a post-religious West, where a lot of people have given up on Christianity, people are seeking answers. Answers to those questions, those existential questions that any kind of thoughtful person is going to ask. Where do I come from? Where do I belong? What's my purpose in this life? Like, what am I here for? And trauma culture comes along and says, well, you are the way you are because of childhood trauma. And don't worry, everyone suffered it to some degree. So that's why you are the way you are. And what your purpose is to heal that trauma. Why? So that you can feel better. You can be a more prosperous person. Very little is in the narrative about, well, you can do your healing work so that you can contribute something to the culture that is so sick and the culture that's making everyone else sick. And so doing that for future generations, et cetera, et cetera. I never hear that as part of the impetus to doing this trauma healing work. It's always about you feeling better. And, what's being attributed to this is just incredible. Like, I'm inundated by it every time I go on the internet. I'm constantly seeing new ads that will attribute pretty much anything to childhood trauma, including, I remember I saw one that said procrastination is a trauma response. I mean, there's no end to it. And so it's kind of like Catholic in that way, this whole trauma theory, trauma culture. Catholic meaning universal. So it's treating this universal problem that everyone suffers from to some degree, and that's big T trauma or little T trauma. And I think it's keeping us isolated, keeping us focused on self rather than fixing what's wrong in the world. So it's a big topic with like deep roots, and it's just so pervasive that I don't know. I'm just hoping, like with the book and with my writing, that it's helping people to start to question some of the narratives that they receive from the authorities who are out there promoting this stuff, and even question the sources of the theories. To take a look at the authorities and go, isn't it strange that it's like mostly upper middle class, wealthy white men who are promoting this theory, and that they're directly profiting from it through their own selling of books, of courses, trainings, all of it. So I'm just hoping that people start to question it more and more, because we've had, about 70 years of psychedelics in the kind of the medical industry in the West, and the world is getting even worse. So something is not helping, something is not working. And so what I try to do with my writing and with the books is ask questions. Question the received narratives, question the way that the West is incorporating psychedelics into quote unquote healing, and to maybe start to think about other ways of doing things. So looking to traditional cultures who have different models for healing, and maybe seeing how we can find our own version of that without just, co-opting their techniques and traditions, but finding our way towards something like a Western shamanism.
Yeah, you when you were speaking, it again reminded me of a couple things. There's a guy from ICEERS, which is an organization that kind of again bridges maybe these more traditional plant medicine paths with Western medicine. But his name is Hieronymo Masarasa, I think. And he said
Hmm.
something it was something I felt, and just the way he said it always really stuck with me. And it alluded to kind of the Christian origins that you were speaking about. And he said when the Portuguese or the Spanish first came to the Amazon, they looked at the indigenous people and they said, these people are too indigenous, like they're not civilized enough. We need to make them more civilized.
Hmm.
And now, interestingly, like fast forward to 2025, it's often that same religious zealotry that also looks at a lot of these people if and when they have a cell phone or a t-shirt, and they say, oh my God, like these people have become too Western, like they're not indigenous enough. They need to be more indigenous. And there is something
Yeah.
very like missionary about that kind of viewpoint. It's also, it was interesting what you said, like that idea, when you're focusing on trauma, but because it brought up also this kind of religious idea, which is this promise of salvation. Like, if I do understand my trauma, then I will be healed or then I will be happy. And yet, also,
Mhm.
as you said, like that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. Like, it seems like the mental health of people is deteriorating. Like, it does seem like there are much greater cases of anxiety, of depression, of feeling out of place, of suicide, of just not feeling whole.
Hmm.
Um, it was
Hmm.
also very interesting.
Not sorry, just to jump in there. It may seem like that, just kind of anecdotally looking around, listening to the news, but if you look at the actual statistics, it's confirmed. People are literally getting worse and worse and worse. You know, as we learn more and more about trauma and there's more access to therapeutic modalities and all of that. So if the stuff was working, wouldn't you see a decline in symptomology and, things like suicide and pharmaceutical dependence and all of that? I mean, you just have to step back and look at it with our logical, rational, materialist Western minds to see that something's off. Things don't line up. Right. And so then isn't the next move to start to question that? Isn't that part of the the kind of one of the gifts of the Western mind is the ability to step back, look at the data, and then, you know, question the hypothesis that you've been working within?
Mhm. So yeah, also I was interviewing a guy. His name is Remy. I think Delon. I'd known about him for a while, and there's an ayahuasca center in the Amazon that I was very familiar with. I had been a few times while I was working at the Temple of the Way of Light. It's called Niuerao, and he was kind of the first guy that I knew of that really went deep, kind of into indigenous Shipibo vegetalismo, like curanderismo, like really dieting, really going deep into that process for long periods of time. Interestingly, he was also a Christian monk before he came to that path. But he said something very powerful that I'd actually never necessarily thought about. But he said that consciousness and cosmovision can't be separated. And I think there's something very profound about that.
Hmm.
And I think it also goes to what you were speaking about, which is also looking at our societies. And it does seem that one of the things about kind of Western psychology or psychiatry, that the way it's practiced now, is it's a very individual process. And again, I don't think that that's inherently bad because again, we are individuals, but it's also this idea of kind of not looking at us in a relational aspect. And I think a lot of these indigenous societies, not only do they view people in a relational aspect, but actually they view the nature of sickness and disease as being relational. And often, I think it's something that's very different in our cosmovision, that we would always look at something, something that's diseased, something that's out of balance within ourselves as being purely a product of some imbalance, something that's only within my frame, within my body, within my mind, within my soul. But in a lot of these indigenous societies, they would say that there is this relational aspect, that, someone else's jealousy or envy or thoughts or actions, um, even diseases. If I get malaria, there may be some relational aspect of that, of a bad air. What do you, from this kind of more Western ideological model or cosmovision, and I think sometimes that's strange for us to speak of maybe a Western model and a cosmovision. We usually, that seems something more foreign, but everything is cosmovision, as you were saying. Like we are a product of our societies. What do you think are some of the things you touched on them a bit, but um, in our Western cosmovision, in our Western model, um, that are not serving us, and that perhaps in these more indigenous or shamanic paths are potentially better ways of going about, of solving or gaining more insight or wisdom into the nature of our problems.
Another big question.
But I mean, this is a big part of what
Cosmovision.
your book is about.
No, totally. Yeah.
I'll give you
And like,
one. So this is a quote that it's a pretty short quote, but I think something very very profound. Kind of to give another kind of anecdotal thing. When I was working at the Temple of the Way of Light, um, I'm trying to think whether to put names, but maybe we will, just because it's names we've already talked about. But we were working with people like Gabor Mate, or people who had these more kind of trauma informed views, and that's how the workshops were set up. And what I noticed, and again, I can't say this with absolute truth because there weren't a whole lot of the workshops, but there were a handful of them. And what I saw is when things were set up that way, I would say at best the outcomes were the same as not introducing those methodologies at all. I would say at worst they had not the same success rate as not using those modalities at all, that the actual modality that was being used was more effective. And one thing that I would always see, and it's kind of boiling things down to very base words, but it was always very apparent to me when someone really connected with one of these medicines, when someone really went deep into a process, there was like two or three words that always sat with me, that I saw in that person, that they were they were living this experience. And one of those was humility. Um, Two was gratitude, and three was a sense of awe.
Mhm.
And none of those were coming from a place of mind. There was no logic, there was no connecting dots. It was a place of deep peace, a place of deep not knowing, but a deep place of gratitude, of humility, of awe. And that was always when someone had a really profound experience, I would always see them left with those qualities. And
Mhm.
the quote that you have in your book, I think is very beautiful, and it kind of summarizes that. And you say, putting psychedelics back in the hand of soul doctors. Um, uh, you said Carl Jung considered the experience of the numinous, by which he meant the feelings of awe invoked by an encounter with the divine or holy, to be the only therapy that can cure what truly ails us. But placing an emphasis on the numinous experience would take psychedelics out of the hands of psychopharmacology and the doctors who prescribe them, and place them back where they belong, in the realm of the real psychiatrists, literally soul doctors, the shaman, healers, priests, and priestesses. To me,
Yeah.
that's very vital because, as you said in the beginning, there's I think you said Eliade, his definition of shamanism was this kind of ecstatic experience, this experience of awe. And always for me, and again, maybe just personally for me, but certainly from what I saw, working with probably over 1,000 people in those environments, is if you had to give someone the choice to have an experience of awe versus an experience of knowing something, whether knowing something in their past, knowing something about their trauma, knowing something about their childhood, those two
Give me awe.
experiences would pale in comparison. That
Right.
sense of awe, it's not that it negates the childhood trauma or anything like that, but I think what it does to someone is it puts things in a relative perspective. And
Hmm.
whatever happened to me in my childhood, however bad, however terrible it was, that's but a frail fraction of who I am. And just having that experience of awe puts all of that in a relative perspective. And it just makes it not that important. It's not that big of a deal. It's not
Hmm.
part of who I am. And we can see that there's so much beyond that, so much of more meaning in life, so much more beauty in life, so many other things where I can focus my intention, I can see the goodness, I can feel it, I can live that all of those other things they lose their grip on us, they lose their importance. And I don't know, and I could be wrong, but I don't know that always focusing on that will ever bring that same experience that one could get through these more traditional
Right.
experiences.
You mean always focusing on like rooting the childhood trauma out? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, completely. I mean, very well said. This is a big part of what I would like to see reintroduced into psychedelic therapy is that experience of the numinous, which let's just say, like at least by Carl Jung's definition of the numinous, awe not being just about the beauty and wonder, but also the kind of terror of the numinous, the mysterium tremendum, that which makes you tremble at its power and otherness. So that's maybe what engenders that feeling of humility in a person when they have a deep experience with, plant medicine or whatever. I mean, I've had so many experiences in ceremony where I'm just kneeling, bowing my head to the wisdom of these plants who have been on the planet much longer than us and know how to live in harmony with the rest of the cosmos. There's an innate order to that intelligence, and just feeling like so insignificant and dumb uh, in front of that. And that's a part of it too. So that's one of the things that we've lost in the West, largely due to the Christianization of the West, is this respect for the the intelligence of nature, to put it very simply, that nature is not there for us to dominate or suffer within, but that we are an intrinsic part of nature, nature, big N, meaning like the whole thing and the intelligence that creates the order and harmony within that. The way I use nature, other people might say God, but I like nature. Um, yeah, so I mean, fundamentally, I think that's at the root of what's ailing us, what Charles Taylor called modern malaise, you know, that kind of general feeling of uprootedness, of lack of belonging. Not only like not belonging to a place, but also belonging within a cosmovision, within a big story, that just isn't about us persevering through this veil of tears and suffering in order to get to the higher place. And I think that's really where the kind of the Western cosmovision has let us down, because that whole thing was based on the apocalypse being just around the corner. And so, in terms of like cutting off ties with your family, with your place of origin, with any kind of, material wealth, that was no problem because they really believed that the end was nigh and it was coming. And so why learn how to live on this earth in harmony? We're not supposed to be here anyway. This isn't our home. We're securing our place in heaven, not securing our place on earth, right? So like fundamentally, I think this is what's wrong. And this is what has led to where we are now with modern psychiatry and psychology in that really kind of limited, narrow cosmovision. Like what you were saying reminded me of another quote by Jung that I really found helpful. He said that it's not so much that we cure our problems as we outgrow them. And how do we outgrow them? Well, we have to expand our conception of what the world is, of who we are. And like you said, then the slings and arrows of childhood, those wounds that are inevitable as we go through this life, we can hold them in a much larger context of who we are. And so, like, I think part of the solution is to like update the cosmovision, to reanimate the Western mind, to start to see by whatever means, but to start to see the living intelligence of the world around us. And that could be psychedelics. It could be, through someone I like quite a lot, Benjamin Sells, who was a friend of James Hillman, who's been a big influence on me, was reawakening the animistic imagination of the Western mind through an appreciation for art and beauty. But I know for me, psychedelics were really helpful in that. But like you said, if we go into that psychedelic experience primed to be looking for the childhood trauma and that's it, that really narrows our focus, and already sets up a kind of an expectation that that's what we're there for, that's what we're there to discover. And it cuts us off from discovering that bigger vision of who we are and what's alive in the world and what it means to be alive in the world and all of that stuff. So that's I don't know, one of my kind of core complaints with the whole trauma culture is that narrow focus on the individual and uprooting that childhood trauma in order to heal it. There's not much imagination there. There's not much kind of cosmovision building.
Do you think also, even in a lot of our modern society, you hear this on like college campuses, these ideas of safe spaces or trigger warnings, like things like this. Like we always need to be safe somehow in order to be healthy, happy, whole. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these shamanic practices arose from environments that were very, very, I don't want to say not safe, because, even in the Amazon, I mean, it's an amazing environment. And if you can live in harmony with it, it's absolutely safe. But there are very real challenges. I mean, I'm probably worldwide between the Amazon and the jungles of West Africa. I mean, I think, I don't know the exact statistic, but I think it's like 100,000 people die every year of malaria, mainly children. These are real threats. There's threats of anacondas, of jaguars, of all sorts of different mosquito-borne illnesses. Where I'm coming from here in the mountains, like the sacred Apus, the mountains, when you go up there, I mean, it's another world. It's silent, and you have to be very careful, because if the weather changes, you're but a speck. I mean, you can be wiped away as if your life had no meaning. I mean, the power of the nature is tremendous.
It demands respect and attention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that also, as you said, like often these experiences that can have some of the more profound changes on us are these very, very difficult experiences where we are humbled, where, I think even in Christianity, that's often where I think that idea of the wrath of God comes from is also understanding like the power. It reminds me of the Bhagavad Gita where Arjuna becomes very comfortable with the human form of Krishna, and so comfortable that he says, "Hey, like show me your true form." And Krishna says, "Are you sure? Are you sure you want to see my true form?" And he says, "Yes, yes, yes." And he shows him his 10,000-fold face, which is a very esoteric number for infinity. And it's so overwhelming that he just has to prostrate himself and beg for him to come back into a form that's appealing.
It's bearable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But often these shamanic experiences, I mean, they were often initiatory experiences. And that initiatory experience, one of the very common motifs was it was taking us into death, whether that was a death of the ego or very often very close to a literal death. Do you think in kind of some of this more Western psychological or psychedelic assisted therapeutic models where you were speaking about that things are very bland, that there's no juice in the room, things are very stale, they're very safe, that part of that experience may be missing, that they can actually really transform someone in a way, when we focus so much on safety that maybe we forget that the world at large is not inherently safe in the same way that, like, is a safe space really benefiting someone, or is it potentially doing them more damage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think the safe space and the culture around that, I don't know if it's damaging to people, but it's definitely limiting them. And I think if people are really interested in transformation, which a lot of people say they are, transformation is risky business. Because in order for something to transform, whatever was there previously has to die in order to be radically transformed. So if you're sincere about wanting transformation, you have to be ready and willing to give up what you brought in to the ceremony. That's just the way it is. So it's inherently risky. And, like we were talking about, these traditional healers are not neutral bodhisattvas. They're complex people who come from a different culture and are susceptible to the attraction of power and things like that. So I think real transformation is going to be inherently risky. Like I would tell people when I was teaching yoga, and I was blessed to find a lineage that taught a very powerful, I think, true form of yoga. One that really worked. It wasn't just about kind of showing off with your gymnastic abilities, but one that was rooted in the shamanic technologies of yoga. So it actually worked to do what it purported to do, which is radical transformation. And I talked a little bit about in my mid 30s having this this kind of crisis where I got really desperate and I had to do something desperate, like desperate enough to go off 3 hours outside of the city to some little yurt where people were drinking this powerful brew from the Amazon and engaging in some ritual. I had no idea of what to do, what it was all about. Like that takes somebody desperate to make that leap of faith. Yeah. What was I going to say about the yoga thing? Oh, when I started teaching yoga to people, I'd often warn them. I'd say, look, before I teach you this stuff, I got to warn you that yoga can ruin your life. But I believe every life needs a good ruining every now and again. My life certainly needed to be ruined. But that's the risk. And the kind of the psychopharmaceutical therapy industrial complex is really not looking to create a bunch of outsiders or revolutionaries. They're looking to uphold the system because the system is working for a certain segment of people. And that includes all of the authorities who are telling you about trauma therapy and theory and healing and all of that stuff and selling you programs. Why would they want to really fix the system that they're benefiting from? So, I mean, if you're lucky enough to have an experience where you get where you can step outside of that, like a real ecstatic experience, not just stepping outside of yourself, but stepping outside of culture and the way you've been conditioned by it, and see things differently. If you're lucky enough to have that experience, it does put you on the outside and maybe makes you a kind of a revolutionary. If you're willing to really live that out and not just kind of go back into the dream, which is really attractive because it's not easy being on the outside. It's not easy swimming upstream. It's much easier to go with the flow. And look, because of what we believe in our culture, well, I've only got another maybe 30 years at best that I'm just going to ride this out and try to be as happy as possible. Because in our culture, like I said before, we're disconnected from any kind of obligation to the future. Any kind of obligation even to our past in terms of ancestry and all the sacrifices our ancestors went through in order for us to be here, and the incredible privilege of being here in this moment and like being born into interesting times. So again, like we're dealing with like very big questions here, and I'm hoping that if anyone's still listening, that they're they're either finding some sort of kinship in hearing other people ask these questions out loud, or maybe maybe it's stirring something in other people who have maybe had a feeling that things aren't quite right, but haven't heard it articulated or kind of named so directly. And then I know other people are just going to shut it off and think that I'm full of shit and I'm problematic, and so are you by association and all of that. So that's okay.
So then, what is the Steelman argument for trauma and trauma informed therapy? Because like everything, I mean, there can be a good side to that. So what do you think that the people who are practicing this, if they are coming from a place of good intention, and for sure there could be people who are not, but like most things, like in general, the road to hell is paved with good intention. I mean, even maybe towards the end we can talk about the more political aspect, because that's I think often the case. It's very rarely these kind of dictatorial leaders that come to power. It's usually people who think they're acting with good intention, but they usher in dystopian futures. But what is the argument that you think these people who are putting such an emphasis on trauma, what do you think the emphasis is that they're looking to achieve, and what are potentially some of the benefits that can be brought about from that?
Okay. I don't know if I'm the right guy or if it's even something I want to do to steel man the argument for, trauma theory and therapy. There's certainly enough of that. What I can maybe offer is some sympathy. There are things that happen in our life that wound us and cause us to shape our personality, our way of being in the world in order to get along. And at times that could be bad enough that it feels like survival. Like it feels like something, if I don't do this, I'm not going to make it. And often that happens in childhood when we don't have a mature perspective. And so like if shutting down like my emotional expression as one example, because it doesn't feel safe to express that in my family, it feels like a life or death choice, because it, in some cases, literally is. So we do things to conform to our environment in order to survive, to get by. That's very real, and that's what I would call is when we're talking about trauma in such a broad sense, that's what most people are talking about. The kind of inevitable conditioning that comes through like us adapting to our environment in order to get along, to survive, to whatever degree. That's very real. And, part of what classical yoga offers is a way out of that. If at some point you find that that's far too limiting, that's limiting your life, your self-expression, and you want to be more free, you want to be more yourself in the world. And so I think that's very valid. I'm not sure that trauma therapy and the way it's practiced with this focus on the wound so much, rather than finding that bigger context, like we talked about outgrowing that through your experience and your capacity for things. I'm not sure if that focusing on the wound so much and keep picking at it, and when you've picked at that one enough, you try to find the other wound. I don't think that's the way to the freedom that so many of us are looking for. Like what's required really is a radical deconditioning process that psychedelics can certainly help with. But there are other ways too, to realize that you aren't who you thought you were, that you're much more. That's the heart of the classical yoga tradition, is that deconstruction process. So like, I'm sympathetic with people who want to be free, who feel that their conception of themselves, their relationship to the world, that it's all too limiting and ultimately not satisfying. I totally get that. That's what got me interested in this stuff in the first place. So I'm sympathetic to that. And I think like within the big umbrella of trauma therapy, there are a lot of things that actually help. There are a lot of, these somatic practices that help reconnect people to their body and find a sense of ease to undo some of the kind of conditioned response to a toxic environment, which is like a lot of holding and clenching and rigidity. But what I always tend to do is point toward the outcome rather than the cause, because if I'm reaching for freedom, if I'm reaching for joy, if I'm reaching for wonder, that kind of takes care of the other stuff that comes along with it. It's like, I don't know, that to me is like the real medicine. I don't keep drinking the poison that I want to cure myself of. I do something that helps counteract the poison. And that's not spiritual bypassing. That's living in the fullness of life.
So it's an interesting word, that word poison. And when we started, you said you're becoming more vocal and kind of more political. Where do you see, because so many things are microcosms for the whole, and I also see kind of this focusing on certain aspects of this work as part of a bigger picture, which is a certain poison, even though that may seem like a strong word. But what do you find within you that's awakening when you begin to look at things at large in this kind of bigger cosmovision of maybe not only how this affects individuals, but societies and peoples and the stories we tell ourselves and kind of how we move forward from that?
What's awakening me more and more as I get older is a sense of responsibility to tell things as I see them and leave it at that, not saying that it applies to everything or everyone, but in my position as a person who is awake, curious, questioning, I was born with that kind of mind, the need to know, to understand what else is out there, all of that stuff. To use that along with my position and my talents, for creating media or interviewing interesting people, thoughtful people, and using that to, just offer maybe an alternative perspective on things. Like, I call my podcast Howl in the Wilderness. And sometimes that's the way it's felt. It's like, I'm the only one howling about this thing that I think is not quite right. And, whenever you speak up against an orthodoxy, you're going to be labeled a heretic. And you're going to be demonized. People are going to try to dismiss you. And that's been going on since the beginning of Christianity. Anyone who had an alternative take to the accepted orthodoxy was branded as a heretic. Carl Jung, at his funeral, the pastor who was presiding over the funeral called him a heretic. And what was he speaking about? He was just saying that we had a soul, and that soul was, let's say, polytheistic, and that it was made up of many different parts, and he dared to question Christian doctrine as someone who grew up in a Christian culture with a father who was a minister. He dared to question the doctrine of the time, and I think he engaged with it very respectfully. And I think he always considered himself a Christian, but one outside of the orthodoxy. He would be called a Gnostic, as if that was a bad thing. Someone who wanted to know, who had the gall to want to know for himself, to have direct experience of the Numinous. So that's what's awakening me, is that sense of responsibility to speak up about what I'm seeing, what I'm noticing, what I think about things, as someone who has some experience in life. I think that's our duty as we grow into elderhood, is we just have a different perspective because of having lived a little bit longer. And, those of us who have sought out the world, and different experiences, we have maybe a broader perspective on things. And I think, in the past, we've always appreciated that. People who came with these big visions of life, someone like Joseph Campbell, who studied all these different world mythologies and religions and was able to communicate them to the Western audience in a way that helped to reinvigorate, I think, the Western imagination for how things could be otherwise than how they are. That the Christian worldview is not universal as they would want it. It's not Catholic. It's actually just one way of looking at the world. And there are many other valid ways of seeing the world. Someone like Carl Jung, who studied everything under the sun. The guy had a what do they call it now? Like a galaxy brain, And so I think those people helping us to expand our vision for how it all could be or how it all is. That's a really important role, especially as things get narrower and narrower, more and more polemic, more and more kind of binary. We need outsiders who are speaking up, who are howling in the wilderness, in the wilderness of outside of kind of consensus reality, of dominant culture. So as someone who's like that and who is kind of torn up by what I see going on in the world, I just feel an obligation or responsibility to speak up. And if it reaches someone else and helps them feel like they're not alone, or maybe we start to build connections and we amplify the alternative perspectives, I think that's the benefit that can come out of it. Because otherwise, with the way the media is controlled and how pervasive the media is, that fight against conformity and conditioning is more important than ever, and it's more difficult than ever because we're inundated with all of this propaganda about how we should be, what the world is, all of that, that shapes us. Like your friend said, cosmovision is consciousness, or consciousness is cosmovision. How we see the world is how we act in the world. I think, we've got a lot to rehabilitate as Westerners.
Well, good, my friend. I think that's a beautiful way to begin to wrap this up. Um, you've recently written a book, and it's called Traumadelic. How would you describe that? Like, what are you trying to convey there, and who do you think that book speaks to?
I don't know who it speaks to. I've heard from a few people. It's been out for a couple of weeks now. And the difference, like, I think I was telling you this before we started recording, but when I started writing critically about trauma therapy and psychedelic psychotherapy, it was probably about 3, maybe 4 years ago. When I first started publishing stuff about it, I got a lot of reactivity from people who were very defensive of the whole thing. And I've noticed that in getting ready to publish the book and putting it out and doing a little bit of promo around it, it seems like people are much more receptive to this heterodox position or perspective on things, or the questioning of the unquestioned authority that this is how it is and all that. So I feel like the tides are shifting. And so I hope that people are much more receptive to some of the questions in the book. What it is, kind of the way I set up the book is that I'm putting psychedelic psychotherapy on the proverbial couch and subjecting it to its own analysis. And so the first part of the book is diagnosis, taking a look at what's been going on in the psychedelic psychotherapy world and trauma culture, just kind of laying it out as I see it, as someone just on the outside of things, but with maybe 1 foot in still. I still work within the systems here. And then the second part is like a kind of a treatment plan, but it's not so prescriptive. I don't know what the answer is yet, but what I try to do is, like what's in the subtitle, is help to start revision psychedelic psychotherapy, and I think trauma therapy in general, to start to reimagine how we could be going about it, because obviously the way that we've been going about it isn't really helping. Okay. And if you can't see that, then the book is not for you. You're not there yet. But just go and do the research, look at the data, like look at those conflicting growth charts, more therapy, more awareness about therapy and trauma and all that, and also increased rise in all of the symptoms of trauma, so-called symptoms of trauma, right? So anyway, if you can't see that, then this book isn't for you. It's probably going to be too triggering, and you're not going to be able to even sit with any of the questions. But I think it's for people who have maybe started to glimpse, like, maybe there's something up with all this. And I do hear from those people more and more who are telling me, I'm really glad someone is talking about this. And so, like, whatever kind of small audience I have, again, I feel that sense of obligation. It's like, I'm seeing things that I don't think are going well, that I don't think are right, that I don't think are really helpful. And I just feel a need to say something about it, even though it's kind of risky doing so, because I still work with like 1 foot in the system. Right now I'm working to become a registered counselor, something that I've been resistant to for many years. But I saw that it would be helpful to become at least registered in my home province, because it would allow people to access my services more, because they'd be able to go to their insuring agency and get compensated for it and reimbursed for it. And it also maybe give me an inroad into some of the organizations that I want to work in, you know, public service organizations and that kind of thing. So I'm kind of jumping through the hoops doing that right now. And that's, you know, so I'm still like working one foot in the system, one foot outside. And I think that gives me a healthy, maybe more well-rounded perspective on it. Because on one hand, you know, I'm a real outsider in this stuff. Like, you know, going to this Brazilian syncretic ayahuasca church and going down to the jungle and working with these Shipibo and Ashaninkan healers and exploring all of the weird yoga stuff that I've done and all of that. Like, I'm really into that stuff and I'm into that world and the strangeness of it and the weirdness of it. But I also, part of the reason that I was suffering so much is that the world around me has kind of gone to shit. And so for me, just to run away from that in search of my own happiness and healing, doesn't feel quite right to me. It feels like it, I don't know what the word is, but that sense of obligation, it would seem to go against that. So I feel like as someone who's kind of been able to have the ecstatic experience of stepping outside of it, getting myself well enough to be like effective, it's my job to like stay in it at least enough to try to encourage some kind of shift. Nothing grandiose, just like little things like more soulfulness, you know, not some major shift of consciousness or something like that. But just like giving a bit more soul to the world that I live in, you know, that has become so kind of soulless and ugly and bland. So I see it as like, I call it cultural activism. It's trying to act in the culture to generate some more of that richness and soulfulness.
So, kind of final question as we begin to part. Um, I think that's a really important topic. That that idea of kind of that soullessness or blandness that's kind of infected our culture. Because that didn't used to be Western culture. I mean, Western culture took great value in architecture and in writing and arts and true liberal arts education of having different perspectives.
Yeah.
And it does seem like it's something we're really losing. As you become older and you're saying you do feel kind of more comfortable in your skin and beginning to speak out more. I think one of the ways in which people do lose their soul is when they stop speaking truth and they do try and conform to something that they know deep in their soul isn't of their highest benefit. And yet there is so much conformity and pressure and, as you said,
Mm.
through media and different
Fear.
narratives, these very kind of powerful forces that I think keep a lot of people in fear.
Mm.
And I know this isn't an easy question, but what advice would you give to younger people, or maybe not even younger people, older people who are still kind of lost in that grip of fear? Um, because obviously there are consequences. I mean, there are consequences in the time we live in of losing your job, potentially losing your reputation. I think it was Arthur Schopenhauer who said so beautifully that all truth passes through three stages. First, it's laughed at, it's ridiculed. The second stage is that it's violently opposed. And the third stage, the final stage, is it's accepted as if it were always true. And I found that to be very
Mm.
true. And, so often that kind of heretical mentality of speaking out, often first you may be laughed at, and that can be very difficult. And often you can be kind of violently opposed. You can be ridiculed. You can be name called. But eventually, if something is true, it will be accepted. But often the heretics don't even necessarily live to that time where things do become accepted. So it is very
Mm.
much a leap of faith. It can very much test our courage or resolve. What advice would you give to people who are maybe feeling like they're not able to speak out, even though they potentially do see inconsistencies or things aren't quite right in their
Mm.
society, in specific disciplines like the one you're speaking about, that may be able to help them begin that journey?
Hmm. Well, to give general advice is I find really difficult. Um, Let me try it this way, though. So the reason why I do what I do is because of a calling. And there's a lot of talk about calling in the self-help world. You got to find your calling, got to find your purpose. Um, I think I look at it like a little differently, like I look at a lot of things a little differently. I call it the negative calling. So it's the idea that I'm missing something in the world. There's something that I'm grieving because it's not there. And that lack, that absence, is what's calling me into my purpose. Like if I look out into the world and see the lack of soulfulness in this North American Anglo culture, and it kind of like really hurts my heart and soul. That actually is my calling to step in and try to contribute something that I do think is rich and soulful and all of that. So it's like this idea of negative calling. There's an old idea with the German romantics. They would say, tell me what you long for and I'll tell you who you are. And part of who you are is what you're here to do. So that's the advice that I would give to people, if any, in terms of like, well, what do I do with this feeling of dissatisfaction or even rage at, what's going on in the world? Is look to see what creates the most grief in you. And then move toward that with some kind of action. Maybe not with the hope of, fixing anything, but maybe of like filling a gap that you see. What's not being done in your home community that really pains you to see? In your workplace, in the school that you teach at, whatever it is. If it's a lack of beauty, well, start by just beautifying yourself and your space. See if you can like stretch outside of your comfort zone and putting on something that reflects your soul. What brings you joy? Little things like that, I think, change the world. Because if we have more diversity, more self-expression in the world, that makes the world a richer place and less of a bland, gray monoculture that I think is really at the root of why we have so much soul sickness in the modern world. And I just have to say, yeah, we talk about the West as some big monolithic thing. What we're really talking about in this anesthetized, bland monoculture is what our European ancestors, what happened to them or what they brought or what they didn't bring from the old world. You're just dodging a verdote or something.
Yeah, something just exploded. I'm not sure what that is.
I don't know.
I think I know. It's my tobacco.
Jar of tobacco exploded, fermenting. Oh wow!
The pop just came off. Didn't explode. So yeah. But,
Okay.
you're onto something.
Yeah. So talking about the bland monoculture that's making us all sick. Just to be clear that, yeah, that's not inherent to the West, because if you go back to like old Europe, you'll see that there was a lot of like aesthetic beauty, cultural diversity, all of that happening in the quote unquote West. But something happened, either because people came over to this new world, quote unquote new world, we have to think about like what they left behind and what they brought. So those people that came were, for the most part, Protestants. Like what we talked about, stripping away all of the superficial stuff of Catholicism, all of that richness. You look at the Protestant churches, and then you look around and see the way the big box stores are designed. They look very similar to me. And so that's the Western culture that is, I think, making us so sick, and the one that grieves me the most. And so that's what I'm speaking of. But like, just to acknowledge that, if you go to anywhere in the old world, you're going to find lots of beauty, lots of cultural richness that hasn't been stripped away. Yeah. So it's particularly like Anglo-North American culture. And part of like the problem is that we continue to export that around the world. This cultural colonialism is still happening, even if it's not under the guise of, Christian missionization or conversion. We're still exporting this kind of culture all around the world. And that's, another whole topic we could get into sometime. But because that's one of the outcomes of the psychedelic renaissance or revolution or whatever you call it, is that we're not just co-opting substances and using them for our own means, but we're also exporting a lot of this culture that's made us sick in the first place. And that's a big part of the problem.
It's interesting in the little village where I live, they've one of the things I really like about it is there's all these stone walls everywhere that are just so beautiful and all made by hand. But now people have started putting up concrete walls. And to my eyes, it's just it's the difference in beauty is night and day. But it is an interesting thing of our time because that concrete wall, interestingly, is more expensive in terms of the monetary value. But you can hire someone, you pay them, and it's up very quickly. And it kind of goes to that more family-based unit or individual-based unit of I'm just going to pay, it's done, it's over, but without any sort of aesthetic beauty or understanding of where that comes from. Whereas the stone wall, interestingly, it's free in terms of the cost. The stones are everywhere. But if you do it by yourself, it would take an exorbitant amount of time. So usually it was a community would come together and all volunteer their time, and then you have this stone wall. And so, but I just find it this very interesting kind of metaphor of how things have progressed, and each has its pros and cons. It's not also inherently good or evil, but there is a very different outcome to it.
Yeah.
That then also interestingly we all live with. We all live with
the concrete house versus the stone house, or the concrete wall versus this. That to me is a great illustration of the whole issue that's kind of underlying everything we've been talking about, is that the kind of the isolation of the individual, or the kind of micro nuclear family into one unit, disconnected from the larger community and its obligations and support and all of that. Like the bland concrete wall, I bet, on the inside, they're going to decorate that and try to beautify their space in some way, but there's no consideration of beautifying the street or the neighborhood or the community. And like you said, well, we can just do it on our own. We'll hire some guys and they'll come in and do it quickly. Again, it's like that function over form consideration. It's just like whatever's easiest, whatever works. That's a great illustration of like the whole problem underlying this stuff. What's wrong with psychedelic psychotherapy as it's being practiced in Anglo-North America? Yeah.
Well, amazing, my friend. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's always just super good to talk to you, and I love picking your mind, and I think there's a lot there and a lot that's super vital. And being heretical, while it has its cost, as I said in the beginning, I think truth is maybe probably the highest virtue that we can strive for, and I think ultimately truth is rewarded in this life or the next. Um, so thank you for doing that and bringing that out. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you wanna address before we wrap this up?
Well, again, I just have to respond and say I don't claim to know anything about truth, but I do have a sense for beauty. And apparently, if you follow the old Greek philosophers, truth and beauty are one and the same, or deeply connected. So I know if I'm fighting for beauty, that maybe that's somehow leading to some sort of fighting for truth. But I think we can all sense what is aesthetically beautiful, what moves us. Um, yeah, so if we focus on that, truth maybe will take care of itself. But yeah, thank you. If people like want to engage with me, there's like a number of ways to do it. I've got this podcast. I put out about two a month, and I feature conversations with a lot of like heterodox, unorthodox folks, people who are working outside the margins. Um, it's called Howl in the Wilderness, as I said. And the book, you can go to traumadelicbook.com to find out more about that and get links to order it. I really would love it if people bought physical copies. I spent a lot of time and effort designing this book and yoga and plant medicine. They're designed to be the same size, so they're nice little companion books that really sum up a lot of my experience and ideas over the past maybe 10 years or so. So it's really nice that I've got them for myself, to have them together, to have these objects in the world that represent this period of my life. Um, yeah, and then people can work with me as a coach and counselor as well if they want to work one-on-one with me. So they can go to brianjames.ca and find out about my offerings there. If you're interested in like this question of like, okay, well, what would like therapy look like if it wasn't so trauma focused? Well, you can come and find out. And if you're interested in outgrowing your problems rather than like focusing on those wounds so much, I mean, we do incorporate that. That's a part of it, but it's part of a bigger whole in my approach to working with people and helping them to well, to live their most authentic, joyful life, you know. Like that negative calling thing, I want to live in a soulful world with soulful people. That's my little selfish desire. So that's what I'm just trying to help cultivate through all the work that I do.
Well, amazing, my friend. Well, you're doing great work, so keep it up. I look forward to whatever you begin to focus on next, because I think it's always super important. And keeping a heretic, just like the guy who's on your shirt. He shook things up too, and I think still to this day he's not really appreciated for what he was pointing to. But I think when people do see that, it can have a very, very profound influence on them. And always this work isn't going to affect the whole, but it is going to affect people, and those people go about and make real change. So appreciate talking to you, man. We'll put a link to all those in the show notes. I wish you well. I hope people reach out to you, and I look forward to our fourth time, whenever that may be.
Yeah, thanks, man. And all the best to you and your beautiful little family you've got now. It's great to see. Thanks, man.
Yeah, thank you. All right, everyone. That's it. I hope you enjoyed that episode. It was very much a pleasure for me to sit down and reconnect to Brian. It's been a while, probably a year ago since I had spoken to him. Really important topic. I'm sure will be controversial to some people. As he said, that idea of heresy is not always met with the the nicest energy, but I do believe what he's speaking about is truth, very important, and to really look at all of these things from a more nuanced and holistic point of view is the way to eventually move towards truth. So I really respect him, and kudos to him for doing that. As I mentioned in the intro, if you're interested in working with myself and also my colleague Merav Artzi, we have an upcoming plant medicine dieta in the Sacred Valley of Peru in February, although we may be sold out, and when this is released, it may already be midway or over. But we do still have space as of now for our upcoming European dietas at the end of April in Portugal and the beginning of July in Ireland. And that's a really beautiful opportunity to go very deep into this work. So if you'd like more information about that, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And then, as always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help. Patreon is a really good option. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers that you can sign up for. Those tiers give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. As always, to all the people supporting that way, thank you very much for your help. It really means a lot. I really like that website because it's also based on this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something, anything from this podcast, that's a really big way to support and to give back. If you're not able to do that, as always, just helping with the algorithms is a big help. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, that's super helpful. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review is also very helpful. So that's it. My next guest, I have some really interesting people lined up. A woman named Melissa, who's a plant medicine practitioner, coming on to share about her story. A woman named Manda Scott, who has a really interesting podcast, also to do with plants and healing. I have a guy coming up who wrote a really interesting book called The Power of Awe, interestingly, which we spoke about in this podcast, and how that's so healing and beneficial. I'm also hoping to bring on, again, my friend Roman, who I interviewed in one of the early podcasts. He has an amazing healing center called Paititi, and he recently released a book, so to bring him on to speak about that. And I have quite a few other guests lined up, but still trying to get all of the orders sorted out. So as always, I hope to bring on really fascinating people. I hope this finds you all well. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all on the next episode.
Doom.